Yeah, so I'm Greta Byrum, and I work on technology, and I start always from a very simple principle, which is that communication is a fundamental human right. And what that means is that communication is key to our ability to plan together, to work together, to resist oppression, to govern together, and to build sustaining and nurturing relationships with other individuals, with families, and with communities. So in order to explain to you how I'm working to secure our human right to communication, I'm going to talk about how I work to apply collective principles to my work, to strategically work within the policy environment of telecommunications, and finally, how I work to demonstrate both principles and policy goals by doing demonstration projects, in other words, by practicing. So I first want to talk about principles, and these are the principles that I apply to my work, and it's actually, there's a number of organizations that use these principles. They are the principles of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, which came together and took as its grounding sort of process a set of principles that were developed by the Colored People's Congress in 1991 that came together to create a set of 17 environmental justice principles. And so using that same process and using those principles as a guide, this group of about 13 organizations in Detroit that worked on housing, workers' rights, environmental justice, food justice, public health, a bunch of different areas. They all came together and said, look, we all need to use digital technology to achieve our goals, so let's create these principles for digital technology. So they are access, participation, common ownership, and healthy communities. So I think it's also important in just grounding this discussion to remember, we often talk about virtual space, and we sort of think of the internet as this like place out there in the cloud. It's really important to remember that digital infrastructure is actually physical and spatial. So I'm going to just tell you sort of the three main components of communications infrastructure. They include conduit, which is the tubes, and then it includes fiber or cable, which are the tubes that go in the tubes. And then the third thing you may not be familiar with is peering centers, but those are sort of big buildings where the tubes connect to other tubes. So those are often called internet hotels, and you may not know what they are from the outside, but inside it's just a bunch of server stacks and tubes connecting to tubes. But that's how, for example, you get your Netflix, is that the data goes through the tubes, and then at the peering points, you know, your wholesale broadband provider connects with your home broadband provider, right? So these are the three main components of the physical infrastructure. But I think it's also important to note that this is really a layered kind of landscape, and that the history of all kinds of social issues and politics and regulation have kind of been embedded into the way that this environment works, right? So this right here is actually called Empire City Subway. Is anybody familiar with that, with what that is? So Empire City Subway is a layer under the streets of Manhattan that you may not know is there. And it's owned by Verizon. And all the tubes and the pipes that go under the streets of Manhattan have to go through this space. And so anybody who's using them has to pay rent to Verizon to use this space. So that's just one example of how the sort of ownership and control is embedded into this as a landscape. The other thing to note about the way that physical planning happens for broadband in particular is that it's all based on return on investment. So broadband gets built where the companies think, oh, we're going to get money back for building here. And that generally means that they don't want to build in places where poor people live. I mean, it's just a basic equation, right? And so this example here is when Google Fiber first went to Kansas City, Missouri, they did this thing called pre-subscription, where they went to households and they said, would you be willing to pay a little bit of money to invest in this infrastructure before we build it? And of course, the people that said yes were the ones that had disposable income. So what happened was Troost Avenue is this dividing line right in the middle there that goes through, right through Kansas City. And basically, this has always been like the rich side of the tracks and the poor side of the tracks. And of course, what happened was that it started looking like Google was only going to build fiber infrastructure on the rich side of the tracks. And so Google, to its credit, actually recognized this problem. They got a lot of bad press and recognized the problem and sought to address it, and it looks a lot better now. However, Verizon won't even release maps because when they roll out Fios, which is their fiber infrastructure, they don't even want you to know where it is and where it isn't. So the decisions about how this stuff happens are made in the policy environment. So I'm going to blow through the policy environment really fast, and don't worry if you don't get everything I'm saying. It takes a long time to understand it, and you should feel reassured, or not reassured probably, by the fact that most lawmakers who are making these decisions also don't understand these issues. So the three sort of main parts of the broadband policy environment are actually the telecommunications policy environment. Broadband regulation, the question of the digital divide, the haves and the have-nots, and spectrum allocation. So in terms of broadband regulation, we have net neutrality, which is the idea that there shouldn't be different kind of, that, for example, richer companies shouldn't have their data moving faster through the pipes than any individual. So you shouldn't be able to pay for extra access to infrastructure. Universal service, which is the idea that everybody should have access to a basic level of telecommunications. And that's something that we managed to do in this country with electricity in the 50s. So it's not like we haven't done it before, but it's really hard in this case because of this question of building for return on investment. And the third piece is privacy and security, which has to do with how much of your personal private information and data are companies allowed to collect and use. So these are major, major policy issues. In terms of universal service, which is also sometimes what people call the digital divide, there's sort of different ways of thinking about it. Digital inclusion is the idea like, hey, we have this really awesome digital world over here, and you guys just need to be included in this cool stuff that we have. So that's somewhat of a patriarchal way of approaching access. Digital equity is the idea, hey, everybody should have the same thing, so we should have equity. Whereas digital justice is the idea that there has historically been injustice, and so we actually have to go a little bit further in order to remedy that. The next really important piece of telecommunications policy is spectrum allocation. So this has to do with our public airwaves. Who's allowed to use what part of our public airwaves? And basically the debate here comes down to, is this like a property rights regime of management, or is this a commons? So these are our public airwaves, and I'm not going to go into the technical part because it's too technical, but basically we've divided up different parts of the radio spectrum for different kinds of uses, or the FCC has. And so FM radio is only one tiny, tiny little part of this, and Wi-Fi is even a tinier, tinier little part of it. And Wi-Fi was actually junk spectrum, like garbage spectrum, that the FCC was like, well, we can't really do much with this spectrum because it doesn't go through walls very well, so let's just give it to people to experiment with. And so that's how we got garage door openers and baby monitors and lots of other stuff in addition to Wi-Fi. So yeah, radio is a really important part of spectrum allocation. These are folks that, based on a new a law that Obama passed in 2012. This is a new Somali radio station that's just getting started in Minneapolis. So it's a very, very small radio station, only about 5 miles radius, and wireless broadband. So this is the place that I work primarily. So wireless broadband is, it can be open or closed networks. They can be municipal networks. So that's muni, that's short for municipal. This also is the part of the spectrum that governs cellular networks, so your cell phone. There's big debate about whether the companies that you pay for your cell phone coverage should be able to offload all their extra traffic onto our Wi-Fi spectrum. That's a big current debate. And then the last thing is mesh networks. So mesh networks are what I primarily work on. And this is a game that I play often with folks that I'm working with. It's called Every Network Tells a Story. And basically this is another kind of way of thinking of that layered quality of telecommunications infrastructure, which is we generally sit down with communities and say, okay, we want to put these devices up on your rooftops. And the devices, these are routers, they're going to talk to each other. And they're going to enable you and your community to create a Wi-Fi hotspot, a big blob of Wi-Fi. And basically what you have to do is figure out who in your community is going to let you put a router on their rooftop. So the social element of this is like thinking about, so this was our neighborhood in New York, and we were thinking about the deli. Would the deli let us put a device on the roof? Would the local office supply store let us put a device on the roof? And basically you get all the devices talking to each other, and they figure out how to route traffic. Okay, so that's the basic principle of a mesh network. So now I'm going to move on to practice and talk about a big project which involves 6 different mesh networks. So this is happening in New York City, and it's funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Disaster Relief Fund. And it's we're doing it in partnership with the New York City Economic Development Corporation. So we're building 6 neighborhood networks in areas that were impacted by Superstorm Sandy. And of course, it's a multi-level partnership. It's federal, city, and local. So if you remember, Superstorm Sandy really decimated telecommunications infrastructure in New York. So this is the Verizon switching station, and that spaghetti is what happened to telecommunications. And so communications were totally out for like 2 weeks in some neighborhoods. These are some of the neighborhoods. So these are the places where we're building mesh networks currently. And in each place, we have a local partner. So these are the local partners. I'm going to go a little deeper now into our partner in Hunts Point in the Bronx. So Hunts Point is a really complicated area. I'm not sure how to use this. Is this the pointer? Anyway, Hunts Point is the area. This is Hunts Point. So it's mostly industrial. That purple means that it's mostly industrial. And when you look a little deeper, not only is it mostly industrial, but there are many toxic sites. Those are the little orange blobs, the orange dots. The whole neighborhood is cut off from the rest of the city by an expressway. And there's also a lot of parks. So it's a really kind of crazy land use. And it's a peninsula that sort of juts out into the water. Oh, and the last thing to say is that the food distribution system for most of New York City is located right on that southern edge of Hunts Point. And it's right next to 2 or 3 brownfields and a wastewater treatment plant. So so it's got some challenges. Our partner there is called the Point, CDC, Community Development Corporation, and they do a ton of environmental justice work. And in fact, they had gotten a little bit of rebuild by design money, but that project eventually didn't get full funding. So they had already sort of built a lot of sort of collective agenda around resilience by the time we got to them. And so the Point, we're working with them on something we call digital stewardship, which is the idea that local folks should be the ones to design and build their own community network, their own mesh network in this place. And so we are supporting them with seed funding. So we're giving them, we're sub-granting to the Point. We're also training them. We're training a trainer to train local folks there. And so the process is co-design, outreach, this training, skills development, teaching people how to build and maintain mesh networks. and then we'll co-define goals with them and really look at what is the impact of this project in the long term. And so the folks you see there, that's Jamil is the trainer that works for the Point now, and that we're training to train other folks. And then the other guy's from the Rockaways. His name is Will Smith of the Rockaways, and he's their trainer. And it's kind of one of the great things about this project is folks from different neighborhoods in New York working together. So this is the footprint that we have planned. This is coming from the Point. This is the area that they want to see covered. It's the part that's outlined in sort of light red. The dots are small businesses. So these are the places that we are going to approach and say, hey, can we put this equipment on your rooftop, and it'll create connectivity for the folks in your neighborhood. Actually, we're not going to do it. The Point is going to do it, but we're going to help them do it. So we won't have devices at all of these sites. It'll probably, in the end, be about 20 of them. But these are the places we've identified as potential places to do outreach. And so we've also created, based on, starting with the principles I talked about at the beginning, we've co-defined some principles along with our 6 neighborhood partners in New York. So I'm just going to read them because I think, they're important, and I didn't write them. Our partners wrote them. We use technology to build participatory governance structures that equalize the flow of resources and knowledge to those that have been economically and politically marginalized. And we intentionally plan for long-term flexibility, adapting to the evolution of technologies and community needs. And I want to just point those out because what we're seeing is a return of the digital justice principles to the environmental justice principles. And that's what I find really fascinating about Hunts Point, is this way of thinking of climate justice and digital justice as interrelated agendas, basically. So these are the things that folks in the Point have talked about that they want to do with their network once it's built. They want to be able to, if there's a flood and it looks like the toxic waste is going to pour into the residential neighborhood, they want to know about it really fast. So emergency information, mutual aid. They want to do air quality testing using sensors because, of course, this has got one of the worst air qualities. There's tons of asthma in the neighborhood. And they want to do tech training. They want to help their residents get education and jobs. They want to put apps and services onto the network. And they want to use the network for sharing arts and economic development goals. And so the reason I talk about all these things is just that these are things that I'm hoping that I can talk to all of you about. And these are points of engagement where all of you could work with me, work with the Point, that we could sort of think about developing these parts of the network once it's built. And that's it. Thanks so much for listening.